Welcome back to the Berg podcast. Thanks for joining us today. With me today is Ford.
Hey, how's it going?
And Dan.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're talking about how to battle increased competition and shrinking profit margins at the same time. And this isn't a new problem, right? I feel like since the day construction began, that's been a problem going back until eternity. There's every time you figure out a way to make money, other people follow and figure out that they can make money doing the same thing, which always increases the competition. And I don't remember many years where the price of things has gone down, right? Is that
if
fair
you remember
to say?
one, let me know. I'm still waiting for that day.
Yeah.
I mean, not because what usually comes with that is a challenge, but at the same time, it's pretty challenging to find a year where things are cost less.
Exactly. So not a new problem, but certainly a problem that I think everyone in the construction industry faces. And just kind of talking through how we deal with it and some things that we've done over the last 6, 12, 18 months as that problem seems to at times have compounded and gotten worse, right?
Yeah, well, and it comes from different spots, right? In other words, so we identify increased competition and margin stress, but you also have it, with labor. You have it with equipment availability based on supply chain a couple of years ago. But we see it everywhere that you're trying to do the same work. And as you said, when you do it successfully as a group, and not so much as individuals, because as an individual company, we could be successful and it wouldn't inherently draw more competition. What draws the competition is when, people realize that it's a good place to be. And there has been some outside pressure into construction, some people who may not have been in construction before, which have increased competition. And then there's also issues with, while they say the markets are expanding, right? In other words, there's all this supposed infrastructure money that comes through. It's so dependent on when it comes through and where, in a local sense, that different companies can come in and try and get some of that market if the money shows up and if it doesn't, right? If the money doesn't show up, the locals who are here have to figure out a way to try and do something that's slightly different than what they're doing. Easiest way to do that is to identify people who aren't really their direct competitors, but who are doing similar work that they can do that work.
Right. Yeah.
And if the money does come through, then you just draw in outside competitors who weren't, in the area before, which then can put either pressure on you directly if it is your work they're trying to do, or on you indirectly if they're going after one of the people who you don't directly compete with locally, that then sends them into your market. So it really is an interesting dichotomy that it doesn't, if the work is there, it's increasing competition. And if it's not, it's increasing competition. It just seems to be where we are right now, that there's sort of, there's a point in the industry where they're trying to figure out who's going to do what and how much of it. And I think outside money is also impacting that as companies are viewed as more valuable and assets. So I think all those things add to increased competition locally.
Yeah.
And then the margins themselves, that's a sort of a different argument, because the problem is that you're having internal pressure where supplies, labor, equipment, everything's getting more expensive, but the cost isn't really going up to the consumer. It's one of the few industries where I would argue costs have not risen at the same rate. You see plenty on the news that whoever it is, that, toilet paper has gone up 130%, but the cost to make it has only gone up 20% and their net revenues are actually up.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like construction, because it's a service industry, is not somewhere that's happened. I think that you actually, if you look at some of the indicators, whether it be concrete, steel, plastics, any of those things, the price of the raw material has actually gone up significantly more than the increase that's been felt in the market. And so even though people are complaining maybe that prices are up, they're not up at the same rate as the labor or supply cost went up. So, and that's just physically shrinking the market, the margins.
Yeah.
Well, it's market disruption, but it's also the fact that, what was it? There was a joke about it, but, in 1978, it cost $2 a yard to move dirt. And you might still see people charging $2 a yard to move dirt in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
So what has to be true to make that work? And size of equipment, speed, efficiency, all those things come into play more than they used to, because you still have to be able to figure out a way to make it around. Every time the rules in the game change, the people that are successful are the ones that figure out how to play in the new sandbox, basically.
Yeah. A lot of times, competition is regional, right? And that's not true in every market. There are certainly national organizations that region doesn't impact sort of their boundaries of where they work. But for companies like us, not significantly larger than us and not significantly smaller than us, a lot of it's regional based. And I know that, we've talked about this before, but at times our competition or perceived competition, folks bidding on similar types of work, fluctuates a lot based on what's happening in other markets of construction, right? Would you say that's accurate? And I think that's where you were starting to go with some of the infrastructure money. So
no, for sure. I mean, and we try not to talk about too much about other companies or other, competitors directly. But certainly the infrastructure work has both, if you think about it, and I'll call one out. If you take like an Allen Myers in our region, right? If you take Allen Myers, I mean, they're vertical. There's a lot of great things about Allen Myers, and they're a really strong company, but they're also huge. They need a lot of work. And so, and their work is both regional and then, somewhat larger than regional as they go up and down the East Coast and other places. So there can be plenty of work, but if there isn't work right where they need it, they need to maintain that workforce. So they need to go find some other work, waiting for it to go. And it can be regional in the sense of there can be federal infrastructure dollars, but if the PennDOT money's hung up, that can impact them. Mm-hmm. And so what we sort of see regionally is that those companies that we have to compete against, sometimes they're in the market, sometimes they're out of our direct competition. And that's common for us where they'll go in and out depending on need. But we also see that even when there's a lot of work, if some of the bigger companies decide they need work, they're just going to take that work, and I remember actually it was before this had to be 8 years ago. I was talking to John Haynes, and I was just flatly asking him, I was trying to understand how the beginning of paving season in the public sector worked, because we were bidding and we were like, these numbers don't seem to make sense to Ford and I. Like, we were fine last fall and it seemed like a good idea. And then we got into the spring and we were like, okay, this is like completely different numbers, to the point of where Ford said, tell me if the price goes down. It went down. And we were like, okay, something happened that we don't understand. And I had, lucky enough, I was able to talk to John, and, he just sort of said, no, this is cyclical. This is the way it goes, that certain companies, and specifically the manufacturers of the material, want to get a certain volume so that they can lock in their work. And so they're going to do that at a lower rate. What we didn't notice was when we came in, they already had it locked in, and we may have jumped accidentally out of a like a niche, you know what I mean, in terms of size. So there's so many finer points to when you're bidding. Is it more or less than X dollars, more or less than X amount of square feet or yards, and depending on that, it'll bring in different competitors that you have to be able to address how to compete with them. And we do it fairly successfully in the public sector, and we're doing a good job of it in the private sector. In private sector, you can build relationships and try and work from there. Public sector, you just got to be low bid. And at that point, one of the things in this environment of increased competition and decreased profit margins, one of the most important things is winning the job at your number, right? The worse than me losing a job is to have to come to you and Ford and say, hey, we won this job. And you would say, like, that's great. We brought another job on. Good to hear. What's the job? We talked through the details. It's much worse if I have to explain to you that I took on a job that we're not going to do well, right? Or that we're going to have to stress our team in order to put it in a position where maybe we could do well. And I sort of take into the line, I don't remember if Ford said it or someone else said it, but that I can stay home and not make any money. Like, we could just not do anything and we won't make any money. It makes sense. And in a technical sense, you'd lose money because you have certain costs that are hard costs. But in this market, you have to be careful when you're bidding that you don't go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, that you don't just start to chase a number saying, I got to get to this number. It costs what it costs. And if at times people are willing to do it cheaper, then you just have to let them do it and hope that the market takes care of itself. And that's where size sometimes can become an advantage or a disadvantage. Bigger companies are able to survive longer periods of doing that. Yeah.
So you said it costs what it costs. And a couple of minutes ago, Ford, you said, in the 70s, it cost $2 a yard. Yeah. Now you still see guys bidding it for $2 a yard. Yeah. So if it costs what it costs, and you're still seeing some of that bidding pattern over the last 40 years or whatever, That obviously has to be, in my mind, contributing to some of what we're calling the tightening of profit margin that seems to be exacerbated at times by increased competition. And you said, before that, Dan, you said that, you don't believe that the cost is being passed on to the end user consumer of the service as fast as it has gone up. And is that in some ways, do you think, is that in some ways the cost of the increased competition? So are we not passing the cost on as fast because of having to do it for a certain price so that the end user or consumer will still find us to be of value? Or maybe I'm saying that wrong.
Well, I think the other problem that we have to talk about that's really interesting, and we've talked about it before, but legislation affects this. Mm-hmm. So there's a job down the street. We weren't involved in it, but I knew the developer for years, and their site package cost went up by like tenfold. Now, it wasn't that the client or the contractor got to make more money. It's that the environmental people and the DEPs and the world had new rules of how the job had to be done, which created more work to be done. So the dollar got higher, even though it didn't get bigger, if that makes sense. So the total package went up to like $3 million. That should have been much lower than that before. But the original project was put some roads in, put some swales in, call it a day, move on, build the houses. They had a bridge, they had basins, they had all this other stuff. So you're trying to keep it, because also one thing that's very interesting that I see is in the old days, developers, we have the gut feel. Like they're like, yeah, we can make this work. And now it's an Excel spreadsheet. And the Excel spreadsheet has to make money, or the developer's not going to do it, the builder's not going to do it, and the site guy's never going to get to even have an option to do the job because there's cost involved in each layer. And so, they have a target in order to be able to make a profit on their job. And so if all this extra work gets put in there, then they're driving it down in order to, so our revenue can grow on a job, but it's not succinct to the numbers that are actually at the bottom. It's still doing the same thing for the same time. So then you have to do it faster, bigger, quicker in order to try and keep those numbers where they were at one point.
Okay. Yeah, there's a project that we have right now that hasn't started yet, that in theory should go to contract very soon. We've worked on it for the entire duration, and it has been a design sort of project for us. And we had a meeting, and we were explaining why the cost increased, and it went up fairly significantly. And in the meeting, the point I was trying to make to the owner's representative was, if you actually look at our cost, we actually reduced our cost from the initial bid. So they added so much extra work, as Ford's talking about it, whether it be DEP related or owner related or utilities, owners' decisions on what they want to do. And they had increased how much work that was outside of this scope. So when we put the bid together, we highlighted what was in scope and what was out of scope. And what we were trying to show them was, we actually realized how much it was going to cost you. And as a partner in this, we realized the math probably would start to get really fuzzy for you. So the economy of scale sort of situation, we said, okay, well, if the project is going to grow by this percent, can we cut a couple percent off of everything we were already doing and make less money, but it'll be a bigger project. So your total revenue gain would actually increase a little bit, but your percentages would go down. So in that sense, we were doing exactly what we're talking about. We were physically cutting our number in order to make it that the project could go. And specifically, I remember I was sitting, it was, I think it was actually one of the snow ones when I went to Cleveland or somewhere. And there was the keynote speaker gave this great speech and presentation on that we had to raise prices so that profit margins stayed consistent. And afterwards I talked to him and I said, so that was a really strong presentation. It made a lot of sense. Have you done that? And he said, oh no, you can't do that. And I was like, you can't do it. And he was no.
It's not actually possible.
He was like, no, well, everyone else is going to lower their price. They won't raise their price. We'd all have to raise our prices. Right. And when you do that, you get a feeling that people on the outside the industry would say, well, that's not fair. They can't raise all their prices. But my thing, and I've said this to any of the guys who will listen, there is a limited number of people who have the equipment. In our specific scenario with Ford being the owner, Ford has a lot of exposure. He has a lot of his money that he earned over decades, in equipment, in buildings, in materials, and invested in people. And it's not really fair that he doesn't get to make money. You know what I mean? Like that's, you know what I mean? If you could have told him 30 years ago that we would be here, he may have made different choices. Maybe he wouldn't, but he might have if you said like, hey, you're going to make, you know, the money that you made when you were just starting out, and you're going to get, you know, 300 times bigger, and you're going to make, 300 less % per person. You know what I mean? You're like, that doesn't sound like it's a diminishing returns sort of situation. So it's something that's going to have to be dealt with, but I just don't know how you deal with it in a competitive environment, you know, because if there's always someone willing to lowball, you know, then what do you do?
But I think that's part of the point, is that there is going to be people that are going to choose to do things. Maybe we used to have a joke when we were estimating people had a broken pencil, you know, or they saw it differently too. You know, it's very interesting. The more complete and detailed a set of prints we're bidding off on, the more competitive the bids are, because everybody looks at it the same way.
Mm-hmm.
When there's ambiguity, that's where there can be opportunity for people to miss something or choose to look over it or hope that they get a change order out of it, which also isn't really great for the thing. But I think one of the things that, like, for the outside world that creates benefit to doing this is kind of the design build mechanism, because it's in everyone's best interest to figure out a solution.
Right.
If they're doing it hard bid, that's fine. I mean, that's the way this business has been for a long time, but you're bidding exactly what's on the prints. You're not looking at it for an opportunity because you have to bid what's in front of you. Whereas if you can be working with the client and the engineers and stuff through the project, maybe finding our suggestions, there might be a way to actually save everybody a couple of dollars and everybody still be successful at the end of the project, if they're willing to put that trust into somebody earlier on in the process.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like part of the solution, right?
Right. That's for the big picture solution, not internally, but just in general.
Yeah, and I think internally it's part of our solution, right? You know, how do we create value for our clients, which afford us the ability to do more work for the same people? And does the relationship afford us the ability to charge reasonable but fair prices and continue to do things that we're good at, right?
Well, sorry, Brian, I cut you off.
No, I was saying, is that fair?
No, that's fair. And it's really where we want to go. You know, we've really, as we've talked about, you know, work we know with people we know in a place we know, right? But as you really start to zero in on that, it's much more specific than that if you're careful. And if you're careful, right, I think the correlation that we'll build, hopefully someday, you know, I don't know what it'll be. It won't be a podcast, but when we're, 20 years from now, if we're talking about this, we'll have realized and hopefully been able to take advantage of and make it who we are. You do not need the top line to increase for the bottom line to increase. So people outside the industry think that the way that Berg is going to make more money, you know what I mean? I'm going to dig a basement for Brian. The way I'm going to dig a basement and make more money is I'm going to dig a bigger basement. Mm-hmm. But that's the hardest way for me to make money. Often you talk about when we buy a piece of equipment, how much more money I would have to bill in order to justify paying for that piece of equipment. And it's sort of that small idea, but on a much larger scale, is we would be much more successful if we had a chance to work through the plans with an owner and say, hey, here's the best way we can do this that's going to streamline this whole thing and make it as efficient as possible and reduce the work we're doing. And be able to work within the parameters of, the DEP, of PennDOT, of the owner's expectation, of the site conditions. We try and work together with engineers and architects and the owner and build the best possible plan that we can, reduce the costs. And I would argue if we could do that on almost every job, it would increase the margin that I would have made had I just done what they asked me to do, even though it cost them less money, right? And so that is probably the answer. I just don't know how you get there. You don't get there quickly, is what I should say. We do know how you get there. You build relationship with clients who then have trust. And they say, okay, these guys are really not trying to just jack up the number. They're trying to work within our budget. But it's really hard to work within a budget when I don't know what the budget is. And also when I have no say in how I help you get to that budget.
Right.
So I think that is part of the answer. One of the ways that it'll occur, especially in the private sector.
Yeah, and part of doing that is in hope that we do in some ways eliminate some of the competition, right? So if we become a preferred partner, if we have a deep trusting relationship with one of our clients, maybe it reduces the amount of competition. I mean, they're going to do their due diligence. They're going to check our numbers. We're going to have to be fair and we're going to have to be reasonable and continue to do good work. But maybe in a competitive bid situation where we're close, they choose that relationship and that quality over something else, right? And so you can't eliminate competition, but maybe we're hoping to try and reduce the competitive pool.
Well, and based on what competition is, right? In other words, so there's two sides to that coin. Is when you're working on a hard bid project, we don't know what the answer is, right? We know what our answer is. Like if I could just go do it and I could charge this much, I'm trying to anticipate all things that are not exactly on the prints, but are not qualified in a way that I can bill for it if it occurs.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't know your answer, right? So in an open bid process, I only have to run one step faster than you to win the race. And I can see you. If we're racing on a track and we're going to run 100 meters, to beat you, all I got to do is be one step faster than you, right? But if I don't know, if we run separately and neither of us knows the time, we could either both run faster or both run slower, because there's not that other person pushing you. So people, I think, would perceive that in that design build setup with only a couple numbers, it wouldn't be competitive. I'd argue it could be more competitive because I have nothing to hide. Like I don't have to protect myself. I'm going to do this work, descope it. If you can, as an owner, have two trusted partners who are going to price any piece of the work, right? I don't care if it's electrical. I don't care if it's MEP. I don't care what it is. But two people who are going to do it that you trust, they're going to do it. And you can have honest conversations about what's in their scope. At the end of the day, the number could be higher or lower than you think it is. It was going to be than you projected, but you can trust that it's the right number.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully if you have good prints and you work through that design build process, the numbers are close, and so it doesn't really become about the money per se, to your point. I mean, there could be a difference. And in our world, I would hope that people would be willing to pay for the services that we want to render in the way we want to render them. But I would argue you're going to get a better price because you're getting a price for the work we're going to do. And if there's extra work, it's because there's work that wasn't foreseen and we have to do it. And that's something that everyone would have incurred, So I definitely think that is the way. I do think it can limit the number of people involved, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it would limit competition because as long as you have two numbers and they're from trusted people, you should get good numbers.
Right. You should still create competition.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that, and I think it's actually, a lot of other industries are talking about less stress per se or whatever it is. And our industry has a high level of stress. And, I think about it always from the client's perspective. Like, whatever stress we might feel, what are they feeling? Because they need the end product. Until it gets to the end product, it's completely irrelevant to them. They're writing checks and they can't use the house, the building, the whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So until it's done, everything that happens in there is just a oh crap moment to them. So like in order to make that design build or that collaborative process, if it makes the project smoother, it gets completed on time, the schedules are realistic, everything goes smoother, it's a win for everybody. It's not going to magically change, and we're going to be living in both worlds for a very long time, but
Sure.
There's certain customers. There's a guy that's not a customer of ours, but he was a customer. My dad worked for him back when my dad had his clearing company. And we don't bid to him because he has his trusted partners.
Mm.
Never called on him, haven't asked to get a bid invite for him. I've known him my whole life. But he has his trusted partners, and they work together on every job.
Right.
And, they help each other out. So it's actually a trade partner situation, which we could talk about later.
Yeah, trade partners.
Versus a subcontractor relationship. But it's so neat to see that, like, they're not going to do the job if they don't all get it. They're not going to, but then they also know they're going to give that person their best number because they want them to get the job, because if they get the job, they get the job. It's just a neat scenario that is few and far between nowadays. The market has just shifted into a different world.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, even, when you're talking, there's other pieces to this that add into it as well, I think, or that bolt onto it, and one of them is Longwood. Longwood's a great example of somewhere where I think that project could have run better had it been more of a design build project. Like, honestly, I don't think it would have increased the cost. I think it would have increased the cost that they had to pay going in on day one.
Oh, right.
I think it may have been able to hold the price. I don't think it would have decreased because there's been many trade partners hurt by the Longwood project financially because of the struggle that the changes have put on them and the way that the contracts are structured for everybody. But it has cost Longwood more. And then subsequently, the reality is Longwood's number one concern was always schedule, but they didn't build the project that way, and so our team has to constantly run into these deadlines that are arbitrary. They are not set by actual conditions. They're not set by the ability of a contractor, subcontractor, or GC to finish them. They're not built on the availability of materials. They're built on arbitrary dates, and we don't talk about it a lot. And, I'll stay positive. Longwood's going to be an amazing place. People are going to walk around it. They're going to love it as it opens over the next 6 to 9 months. The people that go to Longwood are really going to be happy with the product that they're going to get. And it's going to be there for a long time and everybody can go see it. But being in the middle of it, the reality is we have a deadline coming up and they're going to hit the deadline. And the deadline is because of Mother's Day. So if you just sort of step back from like a design build process and you say like, okay, we need to work on this project. Usually you would think like, okay, well, what's going to determine if we can make that date? Well, are the materials available? Do you have the manpower? Can the people work on top of each other? Are there too many trades there? Do we have the materials? Okay, you get all those things behind you. Okay, well, what's the cost of these things, right? You work through that. And then finally you'd say, okay, well, we have all this in line. We can do it. We're going to start on this date and we're going to work progressively. And we give a rough schedule of what we anticipate. And if things change, they change. But at Longwood, what should have been their number one concern in hindsight was schedule, was to say, in order to do this, what would have to happen, right? And then as you step back, you sort of get to a point of the architects and the people inspecting and approving their expectations, the quality, and you'd have to build that into the schedule to say, okay, well, if this is as it were in the normal world, or as it is in this very specific environment where things are as close to perfect as possible, what impact would that have on schedule, right? And you should have worked backwards, I think, and then worked into, okay, well, to accomplish that, what would it take? And then once you know what it would take, what would it cost? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the struggle that puts so much pressure on the team building Longwood for us and for everyone else down there, is that you're sort of working backwards, where the deadline is what it is. Now you have to figure out how to do it. So you've set both sides of the pressure on the teams by saying you have this amount of money and you have this amount of schedule, and then you just compress it. And as you get closer, it becomes an ironic twist, because you'd want to say, well, we're almost done. So we start to, you can take a deep breath, but you actually start to feel more pressure because the time constraint is really the driver. And ironically, when it's all said and done, one of the major things we'll take away from it is how important that piece is. Mm-hmm. How important it is when somebody says something has to be done by a certain date, that has to be the driver. And it has to, in a perfect world, it has to make it that's how you bid the job. And the reason I bring that up is the relationship, is that if you have a good relationship and you have a trusted partner, then you can have that conversation. But when you're just hard bidding stuff, that's hard because you're just bidding it, and you know what you know, and you try and do it as best you can.
Not to jump us off, but I know one of the other projects we're working on bidding through right now is using that 4D BIM thing, which is kind of built to try and alleviate some of these challenges.
It is.
It'd actually be fun to take that project and actually run it back through that scenario, because basically, for people that don't know, BIM is basically you build the project in a virtual world and see how it conflicts. Like, oh, there's going to be a crane here, so you can't do this part of the project because there's a caution space around it. Like, it basically builds the project, finds all those conflict points, points them out to you during the job, and then you get a finished product. I've never actually seen it, but I've just seen promos of it.
And we're going to see it on this, we'll see it on this project. And it is really interesting. And I think ultimately, if we go back to where we started here, that in 1970 something, it cost $2 a yard, which is a real thing, and now people will still do it for $2 a yard. And you said, we say like, well, how can you do that? The way you do that is you aggregate, or put a bunch of costs and spread them over all the projects you do over the course of, maybe a decade. and spend money on some services and some technologies and some other things to try and figure out efficiencies that would have not been seen before. And then you try and perform it in a way to take advantage of those efficiencies, and the efficiencies you make up make it that you can survive in that world. But what's hard is that that's not happening. You know what I mean? Is that you're so many of the times we aren't there yet. So you're just going into these projects and you're just, there was a guy that I used to work with, Greg, and Greg, it's a book, but at one time he said, "What's your plan?" And I said, "Well, I hope." And he said, "Hope's not a strategy," which is, that's a whole theory, a whole book and everything. But that's where we are a lot of times, sadly in this industry is you go in and all the math, and then you got to get to a number that's going to win. And if you're going to get to the number that's going to win, I question how much you knew it and how much you were hoping, you could do it. Dylan actually has talked about at another company he worked for that they would have jobs on the books and be at a certain percentage. And they would, when it went on the books, they would actually make the percentage higher than it was. And then they would meet with their team and say, you have to make up those points that we gave away because this was the number to win. So we're there, but you're X percent short on a very large job. So you need to come up with plans that will find that money. Right. And that's where you get to like that crazy level of thinking, like it can be done.
Right.
But that's a lot of stress on your team. Right. At what cost to your team? Where versus trying to find trusted partners and work into it. So if we're going to say what's the solution? The solution has to be working with people who trust you and you trust that you can build a plan that's constructible at the number they need to be at, and it works. And if it doesn't work, then you have to be able to, be willing to step away as the contractor or the owner, because that's the answer. If you're not willing to step away and you take the stance that you are going to do that project, well, you will do the project, but you may work to lose money.
Yeah, it may not be the success you were hoping for.
Yep.
So, that's probably a good place to wrap it up. A lot to be said about that one, but thanks for joining us today, folks. We hope you got something from this, and we hope you come back for another episode.